And importantly, this is from a developing nation's point of view, this is not telling the developing nation what it has to do. It's saying, if you do this, if you do a carbon inventory and you classify your country into these two types of terrestrial carbon and you change your land use practices, then you have the opportunity to get inflows of money. So it's really just adding one more economic development option to the suite of economic development options that the country has. It's not locking up the landscape. It's saying, here's one more way you can make money out of your landscape, and it has a climate change benefit, so we're going to pay you for it. Which, by the way, is what most of the proposals on how to deal with RED, or reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, work. They're paying countries to change their land use decisions for the climate change benefit, and using climate mechanisms, whether they're a carbon market or a fund or other mechanisms, to get money from countries that are paying for that service to countries that are providing it, or going down to the subnational level and the private sector involvement. So as a quick example for Indonesia, and this is just forests, so we obviously go broader than forests in our proposal, but this is just using forest data. There's approximately 86.2 million hectares of forest in Indonesia at a rough average carbon density of 140 tonnes per hectare. So if we use our method, sort of splitting things into orange and blue, and we use the forest classification system in Indonesia, where they have forest plans and they have laws and policies on how to deal with or what's allowed, what activities are allowed on forests, we end up with about 32.6 million hectares, or 16.7 gigatons of carbon in protected terrestrial carbon. So we're saying that that carbon is always going to be there if you apply your laws, if you think about the biophysical constraints. We as an international community caring about climate change shouldn't have to pay you to keep that carbon. You always have to keep that there. In terms of tradable terrestrial carbon, it's about 27.5 gigatons sitting there. Our system allows you to sell that total tradable terrestrial carbon over a 50-year period. So every year you can sell 1/50th of that total tradable terrestrial carbon, which ends up being this number here of 550 megatons of carbon dioxide per year over 50 years, which when you multiply it out goes back to that 27.5 gigatons. So if you assume two things, assume that the price of carbon, in whether it's a market, whether it's a global market, whether it's a bilateral market, wherever it is, or a voluntary market, is $20 US per tonne of carbon dioxide, and that Indonesia halves its emissions from deforestation. So this is not stopping deforestation and economic use, other economic use of the landscape in Indonesia. It's saying half of what you were going to deforest, you don't deforest anymore. That basically means they can sell half of this 550 number every year. So 225 times by $20 a tonne equals $5.5 billion US dollars. So that's the magnitude of financial flows we're talking about. And it's based on those caveats of a carbon price of $20 per tonne, and that Indonesia would halve its emissions from deforestation. So there's the economic incentive for a country like Indonesia to play in this game, is that it's getting that inflow of money into its economy, which it otherwise would not have got. And the incentive for the rest of the world is that whatever the carbon price is, we're getting climate change mitigation. So we're paying for a service, which is carbon storage, which equals climate change mitigation. We can't do it. We simply can't avoid dangerous climate change if we don't use this 25% of the solution. Carbon capture and storage doesn't exist yet. It might exist, but even if you look at the McKinsey cost curve, and the new version is coming out in the next few weeks if it hasn't already come out, but at the terrestrial carbon part of the solution is essential. So it's not about having a choice here. If we want to avoid dangerous climate change, we have to use it. So here's the way you can do it. You get financial flows into countries like Indonesia, which gives them the incentive to change their land use decisions, and it gives us a way of, as a globe, of avoiding dangerous climate change. And as I made the point earlier, that Indonesia could decide that it's not going to sell all of its tradable terrestrial carbon for any number of reasons, but two that are important is that it might want to pursue other social or economic development goals with that land and decide that it does want to emit the carbon. And the second is that it might want to do an OPEC-like cartel arrangement or a supply management, so it's not flooding markets with too much carbon and therefore dampening the price and therefore reducing that 5.5 billion. And just, I want to be clear, these are indicative numbers, so we're not saying that this would definitely flow to Indonesia. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in a country like Indonesia or other places to get the infrastructure in place and to actually do things like halving forest emissions. So finally, the critical path to success that we see, apologies for some of the small writing, but we have a big UN conference in Poznan in 2 weeks, or thereabouts. We believe that there could be agreement on rules for early action, which we mean at Copenhagen Agreement is expected to deliver a framework for action and incentives from 2013 onwards. There's a gap between now and 2013. Even if Copenhagen lives up to optimists' expectations and delivers that overall framework which takes us away from dangerous climate change, there's still a lag between 2009, the end of 2009 when Copenhagen is, and 2013 when that agreement would most likely kick in. There are countries, private sector and NGOs and academics and countries both in the developing world and the developed world, and Australia is one of them in the developed world, which is already working on this issue of trying to bring terrestrial carbon into the international response. So we think that at Poznan, the world could agree at the UN meeting to what the rules are for if countries do things between now and 2013 under a set of rules, they would be generating real credits which they could sell either in the current commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol or bank them and sell them in the post-2012 or the 2013 onwards commitment period. The rules could change in Copenhagen. We're not saying you need to bind the UN's hands at Poznan. We're just saying for countries that are wanting to get out of the blocks quickly and learn, let's give them more rules for that early action, knowing that we might tighten them up and put some details around them and change them at Copenhagen or even post-Copenhagen in a technical discussion that goes on under the UNFCCC. We believe that there's consensus on what those rules should be, and that's from a broad range of countries, NGOs, think tanks and scientists. The second is we should move to national scale demonstrations through 2009 based on those rules for early action so that we're learning at the scale that the world wants us to learn. Everyone who talks about forests and climate change or terrestrial carbon and climate change in a sensible way, I think it's fair to say, talks about national level accounting frameworks for what's happening with the terrestrial carbon. So it's good to do project level demonstrations to show how you change land management decisions, but it's essential we learn at that national scale what happens with national level accounting. And again, the Australian government is being proactive in helping governments set up national level accounting systems. We should do that in 2009. Copenhagen, terrestrial carbon, not just RED, should be included in the Copenhagen Agreement, and then 2010 onwards we need to implement in, again, based on either the rules for early action or the rules set out in the Copenhagen Agreement so that we can start on things. You can't do a carbon inventory overnight. It's going to take a year or so or more for a country to do that national carbon inventory to set up the institutions. So that's where we see things heading, and I'm happy to take questions or Warwick to moderate. So thank you.
We've got about 20 minutes for comments and questions from the floor.
Fiona Wayne, Environment Business Australia. Ralph, you mentioned a lot about forestry, but what about the silica phytoliths or the plant stones? Some of the research that we've been reading is a 1% improvement in soil carbon per hectare can draw down carbon by about 100 tonnes per hectare, I think it is, and we've got 500 million hectares in Australia. And then the municipal putrescible waste chain, turning the food waste back into biological fertilisers to go back to the soil instead of out through ocean outfalls. And the point of that question is, could Australia not immediately be using these programs as low-cost offsets for the trade-exposed, energy-intensive companies who are going to perhaps find it marginally more difficult to abate their emissions than others.
As we say in our document, terrestrial carbon and soil carbon is very important in the overall picture. In terms of abatement and whether you can use it as an offset within the Australian emission trading scheme or a solution to climate change, I focus on developing country issues, so I probably won't have a great answer to this. Warwick, maybe you want to take it on?
Yeah, Fiona, I mean, it does depend on what the system is at the global level in the mitigation markets. This is where I think if we get a series of national markets, then it would be quite within the right of Australia to accredit certain types of offsets coming into our market because it's our market. If we had a global system, that would be much, much harder to negotiate because you have to get consensus amongst everybody who are participating in the market. If your policy is to look at what the world's doing and jump into a global system when it happens, that's one strategy that some governments take. The other strategy is just to move ahead and do policy. Now, I believe we should move ahead and do policy and not constrain ourselves by waiting for the action in the rest of the world, but you design a system where we cooperate with the rest of the world and we can plug in effectively if the world ever reaches a uniform agreement. So again, I would bring this on into the Australian system as early as possible. The danger you face, though, is that you've got to be careful in terms of the price volatility, especially if you bring too much carbon that's not well accounted for into a domestic market, you can run into a problem with debasing the local currency in a sense. So we talk about in the paper that you need a very serious accreditation program in the country that's doing the policy. So you need a global accreditation system, but secondly, you also need a mechanism for a safety valve. So again, under the McKibbin-Wilcoxon approach, it'd be easy. We could say, let these credits come in up until the point where the price starts to fall below our committed price, and then we won't let any more in this year. And so I think the global financial crisis is a perfect example. If you don't get the global system right, you don't get the measurement and the monitoring and the incentives right, if you get a bad outcome in one part of the world, the entire system can fall over. And that is what I believe is the philosophy, but that's not what we're talking about today. So you can plug this into a Kyoto world if you want, but you have to wait. You can plug it into my McKibbin-Wilcoxon hybrid world in 2010 as long as we've got our own set of rules and we've got a very clear, transparent mechanism for monitoring and enforcement in the other countries that we're talking about.
Andy Green, I was interested in your Indonesian modelling and whether the 5.5 billion, was it's attractive to them. In other words, they've got other things to do with that land. It's their choice. Did you look at whether that is attractive and how that's conditional on commodity prices, for instance, and other things that would lead them to make other land use decisions?
The answer to that is no. So those numbers are just maths based on classification of forest, which is real, so what the government does with its forest and has planned for its forests, and an assumed carbon price. What we're doing as the Terrestrial Carbon Group in some follow-up research with 5 other organisations around the world is looking at that very question of what is the so-called opportunity cost, or at what price would you get different land use decisions being made to flip people into carbon storage versus into other commodity production. So we have done that on a global level, country by country, and we'll have the results ready for the Poznan meeting. So there'll be preliminary results will be released in 2 weeks, and then we're refining that data and the analysis to use a much more complex dynamic model of demand for commodities and land use with the EASA, which is the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, which is, I think, really one of the 3 leading modelers in the world. So working with them to make that analysis much more robust, and we'll have that out by the Scientific Congress in Copenhagen in March next year. But it's a very important, it's really, in my view, it's the most important missing piece of information for countries. And when you move to, let's say, Africa and some of the Pacific countries, perhaps, rather than Asia and Latin America, how are countries meant to make decisions at an international negotiation which is potentially going to affect the way they can use their land and their and financial flows into their country if they don't have the basic information on which to make those decisions? So even Canada got it wrong, really, in the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't realise that the bug was going to do so much damage to its forests, and so having all this unexpected deforestation, which is causing havoc for its greenhouse gas accounting. So for countries in all over the developing world, they really need that basic information, we think, and that's based on discussions with negotiators from those countries. So there.
There's a question down here, a question at the back, and then a question here.
Harley Wright, Climate Council. If I understand your proposal correctly, you're paying people to maintain stocks of carbon on the ground in a forest. Is that correct?
Yes, and to grow new carbon.
And to grow new carbon.
Yep.
On a Kyoto compliant forest, on a bare soil.
On bare soil.
Okay.
It's about climate change, and climate change is greenhouse gases.
Yep.
It's about
both.
New.
Okay.
Yeah.
But my question is, presumably there's some caveat on that forest that it must not be cut down in the future. And how do you cater for that? You pay people money, and then sovereign risk, it can either be cut down legally or it can be knocked out by a wildfire. What sort of controls or insurances do you have about the long-term storage of new stored carbon?
We have two answers to that. The first is that because we deliberately split up the total tradable terrestrial carbon into 50-year kind of blocks, so you can sell your first 50th in year one. You can only keep selling carbon storage as a service if your accounts keep balancing. So each time on that diagram, you changed a block of blue into a block of orange, essentially protected it and sold it as a credit. Next year, that orange has to be there. If it's not, and this is in the detail of the document, so the accounting system says if it's not there, then you can't access that $5.5 billion of new revenue until you rectify that accounting balance. Then I think at a national level, you can do what some of the voluntary standards do, which is set up buffers and say you can only sell 70% or 50% or 90% of your carbon that you're storing as a credit, and the other percentage you leave as basically an insurance. And in our document, again, we propose some national terrestrial carbon reserves, which would do that at an aggregated national level and even an international kind of IMF-like body.
Yeah, what's important here too is because it's forward-looking, and you know the country's accredited reserve. If a country decides not to stick in the agreement and then to pull out, it not only loses the payment for this year, it loses the present value for the next 50 years. And so you have a strong incentive to stay in the system or to get back onto that trajectory, because once you deviate, you really do lose a lot in present value terms. So the forward-looking nature of this is very important. And you could argue that some countries won't be interested in this, and it may be the case, but I think in most countries you'll find that the incentives that we're providing are better than the existing incentives by a long way. There's a question at the back.
My name's David Boffinger. I'm no one of consequence. Just getting straight exactly what you're trying to achieve here. I mean, you're trying to prevent dangerous climate change. So what you really care about is extracting carbon from the atmosphere during periods of the Earth's history when climate change is already getting kind of dangerous. I mean, at the moment, if our temperatures go up a bit, it's probably not that big a deal. If in 2050 or 2075, when temperatures are already up a few degrees, they go up a bit more, it is a big deal, and that's something we really want to prevent. So it seems like what we really want to have is schemes that are ready to suck carbon out of the atmosphere when the crunch comes, rather than doing it now. And yet, the first proposal you seem to be putting forward is reforestation. Now, reforestation only works while the forest is growing. It really only sucks carbon out while the forest is growing. So it seems like something you'd wait and only do late when things were getting bad, rather than doing it as an early stage procedure. Are you following this, or do I have to?
Yeah.
Yeah. It just seems like it seems strange that you would try to use reforestation at this time. I mean, perhaps it would make more sense using it in 2075, but using it now, it just doesn't seem important to suck carbon out right now. What we need to know is that we can suck carbon out when it's getting nasty.
But remember, what matters for the climate are the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, not the emissions any particular years. So the idea is to actually start acting now to get those concentrations from rising sharply. So intertemporally, it makes sense to do some action now, some action in the future. By using a carbon price as the driver of this market, that price, wherever it comes from, if it's actually driven by a carbon constraint, will actually lead to the optimal allocation of present versus future, you would, in theory.
I think also if you look at some of the IPCC charts and other analysis that's done on it, the longer you wait, because it's about atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, if you're just letting it build up and doing nothing to mitigate either by stopping the deforestation emissions going into the atmosphere and adding to that concentration, or growing new forest and therefore bringing some out and therefore lowering the concentration, the longer you wait in terms of mitigating that concentration, the harder it is to bring you back down to a 450 parts per million level, which is where, let's say, some of the IPCC numbers are, or the 350 or 300 parts per million, which is where the scientists are now talking we need to get back to. So and there are people with more expertise in terms of the climate science here, and I'd be happy to open it to them. But the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes. So it is essential that we do everything we can now. And the second point I'd make is that when you're talking about deforestation, the forests are disappearing. If we wait till 2075, current rates of deforestation and demand for timber, soy, beef, oil palm mean that the forests are going to be gone. So the opportunity to do something with that 25% of the solution is disappearing even as we speak now. So you do have to act now. You can't wait.
And then another microphone.
If you get the finance mechanism in line as well, there's a possibility that the actual guy on the ground and put it together at the front to begin with could be offered low impact ecotourism as well as keeping his forest. And if you get, say, activities which would be compatible with keeping the forest, say Brazil nuts and shade-grown coffee, if you give them a decent price. If you put those along, you got a much better chance of keeping the forest. Like in Africa, it's been shown that going to private reserves, elephants and zebras pay a whole lot better than cattle. So you get people keeping the animals and getting rid of the cattle.
Yeah, I mean the critical point here is the property rights. Who actually owns these rights? And that's critical. If you create these financial mechanisms but there's no property rights, people will go and rip out the forest because you might as well grab it while you can. And the idea of creating these financial incentives from the outside is it gives the governments inside the incentive to have a property rights system developed under their own different social systems where those people on the ground look after the resources. Because if they don't, the governments don't get the money. So there has to be a very big change in the way some societies function, particularly in the way that they understand property rights. But it seems to me, again, if you don't go down a system that encourages the development of property rights, as you say, you have got little chance of actually solving this problem.
And I agree with you that this is another instance where just because you're providing a carbon storage service doesn't mean you can't provide other services on that same bit of land. So if you can double up and make more money, all power to you, and that's great. So, but yeah, whether ecotourism is scalable to solve 25% of the climate change solution is another question. Whether everyone can be generating income from ecotourism to unlock all that 25%, I think is debatable.
Okay, we have a question down here.
Josh Dowse from Macquarie. Appreciate that this is a national scheme system, largely. Could you just remind us from the detail of the document what happens with the early action on projects? Because if we're dealing with some countries which obviously don't have the national capacity and frameworks in place and may not have that in place for some time, you've still got a situation where you want early action to protect the deforestation. But I guess asking for your views on how that work might be folded into the national schemes you're proposing.
In our document we suggest that one very simple way is to use what's become known as the nested approach, which is really a transitional approach which allows project level activity to take place, like you're talking about, in an early action sense, or even not in an early action sense, even once the rules have been finally agreed, so that you allow that project level activity to take place and generate credits. and then there's a time period within which a country has to have its national accounts in order for that country and projects within that country to keep playing in the incentive system. So it would be again, it can be negotiated from 2 years to 5 years to 10 years, or a transition period where you're moving towards a national level accounting. And just to really make the point strongly that while we talk about national level accounting and the need for that to deal with some of the difficult issues of leakage, additionality and permanence particularly, we certainly envisage a world where there's private sector activity going on underneath that national accounting to actually unlock the carbon storage potential.
There's a question at the back. There's two next to each other.
Nicola Bynan from Humane Society International. Ralph, Warwick, I'm interested in your views as to whether avoided deforestation ought to be included in Australia's CPRS, given that deforestation and degradation still represents about 11% of our total emissions, because it would seem to us to make sense that landholders that have existing opportunities to clear land here in Australia ought to be able to opt into the system and get credited where they choose to forego that opportunity. We've just had a letter from Minister Wong this week saying, no, too hard, too difficult, too many landholders to deal with, we're not proposing to do it. Is that a valid excuse, given that we're expecting developing countries to be able to do it at the UNFCCC?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I guess it really does depend on how you set up your emissions trading system in the first place. Again, if you followed a system that I'm advocating where you have a safety valve price, those landholders could be not built into the core long-term emission trading system, but they could be given the right to sell annual permits into the market to help stabilise the price. So they're integrated at the margin year by year, but they're not a core part of the emission trading system. It is possible to design a system like that. Then the questions of monitoring and complexity of measurement doesn't undermine the actual system itself, because it's a core long-term system in operation, and then there's some filling in of permits at the margin, either by landholders or by the Central Bank of Carbon in my model. So I think it depends on the system. If you go down the CPRS stated model, it becomes much harder to bring in these other activities. And if you're expecting that system's going to plug into the Kyoto world, then you're reluctant to bring them on, because you might have to take them out if you join this international system. And so it depends on the nature of the emissions trading system. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'd add that at sort of the high level, the most important thing is that we have comprehensive greenhouse gas accounting. And so the main thing is that LULUCF is, or land use change, forestry, or whatever it's going to be called, is accounted for properly in Australia's and every other country's greenhouse gas inventories and accounting. Then really it's up to each country to work out, well, how do I best incentivise the change that I want to incentivise to bring my accounts into balance or to the level they need to be. And if that means that Brazil wants to do that and Australia doesn't, but we still avoid dangerous climate change, fine. I mean, it's not, yeah, so I think it's the main point is that you have to account for all the emissions from the land sector.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question. The gentleman to your left.
John Ridley from Ocean Nourishment. I just wondered if you could elaborate further how you come to the 25% figure, because I think that's the crux of what you're talking about today, 25% of the solution. And is that coming from a negative, say, 2.5 gigatons of carbon today to carbon neutrality, or going beyond that to being part of the solution in terms of what's going up in mitigation, in terms of emissions? And how do you account for things like melting permafrost, which is releasing, copious amounts of methane? And isn't the terrestrial system that got the capability just to plug some of the major leaks which are happening around the planet, rather than proposing that it could be 25% of the solution?
The 25% number comes from the McKinsey & Company cost curve analysis done, released in 2007. And that's basically looking at getting to 450 parts per million. How do we get to 450 parts per million at below 40 euros per tonne? So it's using a marginal abatement curve to do that. And it's saying here are all the different slithers that we have. When you add up all the different slithers that are terrestrial carbon, whether it's through reducing emissions from the terrestrial system or growing new terrestrial carbon, you get to 25%. So that's where that number comes from. And then I think it links back to, in a way, to Fiona's very first question, which is, well, as we know more about what the terrestrial system, permafrost and soils can do, then maybe that number's going to grow in terms of the mitigation potential for terrestrial carbon.
It is critical, whatever you design, that it's flexible enough to adapt to the information over time without undermining the fundamental value of the asset and property rights you're creating. It's a delicate balance, but we believe it can be done. Now, we should stop here. I'm sorry to cut the conversation short, but Lowy lunches are always well known for being on time. I'd like to thank the two presenters and thank you all for excellent questions. Thank you very much.